The first 4 men out of that tunnel were running so hard that Thomas Birdcloud split his boot leather on the rail ties and didn't notice until he was a quarter-mile down the mountain. He ran on a bleeding foot for another half-mile before any of them stopped, before any of them could even form words. Behind them, the mouth of bore 17 sat open against the mountainside like a wound that wouldn't close. No sound came out of it. That was wrong. A tunnel with 23 men working inside it should produce noise. Hammers on rock, the clanging of survey equipment, voices bouncing off wet stone. The Consolidated Rail Extension Project had been pushing that bore through the Blue Ridge for 11 months, and for 11 months the mountain had given back every sound men put into it, amplified and distorted by 1.5 miles of raw granite. Now there was nothing. Not silence the way you'd call a quiet room silent. This was silence with weight to it. Silence that pressed outward from the tunnel mouth like something physical, something that displaced the November air and made the trees at the clearing's edge go still. Birds had stopped, insects had stopped, even the small creek that ran along the grading road had gone quiet, though its water still moved. Thomas Birdcloud, 26 years old, a Cherokee laborer from the Qualla boundary who had taken the job because it paid $3 a day and his wife was expecting their second child, stood in that unnatural quiet and understood something that would take him the rest of his life to carry. He had recognized what came out of that chamber the instant the breakthrough blast punched through the last 8 feet of rock. Not the smell, not the sound, the specific quality of the silence itself. He had never encountered it before, not in any direct sense, but he knew it the way a man knows the face of a grandfather who died before he was born, because he has seen the photograph so many times it has become memory. His grandmother had described this silence to him when he was 9 years old, described it carefully, precisely, the way you describe a rattlesnake's markings to a child so the child will know to run before the bite. She told him there was a place in these mountains that must never be opened. She told him what would come out if it was, and she told him what the silence would feel like, because the silence would come first, and the silence was the warning, and if he ever felt a silence like that, he was to run and keep running and not look back for any reason, not even if he heard his own mother's voice calling him from inside. He'd thought it was a story, the kind old women told to keep children out of mine shafts and off cliff edges. He didn't think that anymore. My name is Thomas Birdcloud. I am 71 years old, and the cancer in my lungs will kill me before Christmas. The doctors in Asheville are kind about it. They talk about comfort and dignity and the time I have left, and I nod and let them believe I'm afraid of what's coming. I'm not afraid of dying. I've been ready to die for a long time. What I'm afraid of is that when I'm gone, no one alive will know what really happened at Bore 17. No one will know about the 19 men who walked into that chamber and never came back. No one will know about the 5 wealthy men in Richmond and Charlotte who financed the whole project, knowing exactly what was inside that mountain. No one will know that the 12 feet of concrete they poured to seal that tunnel is not a containment. It is not a binding. It is a cork in a bottle, and the thing inside the bottle agreed to stay because it had gotten what it wanted. For now, the official record says 19 men died in a tunnel collapse on November 14, 1928. The official record says the Consolidated Rail Extension Project suspended operations due to unstable geology and that the bore was sealed for safety. The official record is a lie, every word of it, and the men who wrote that lie knew it was a lie, and they did it anyway because the truth was so much worse than a cave-in that no sane bureaucrat would commit it to paper. I've carried this for 43 years, watched the other 3 survivors try to carry it too. Watched what it did to them. I'll tell you about that later, what it cost them, what the weight of this knowledge does to a man over decades. But first, I need to tell you about the tunnel, about the project, about what we were really digging toward, even though none of us, not one of the 140 men on that crew, had any idea. The Consolidated Rail Extension Project began in January 1928, funded by a private consortium of 5 investors out of Richmond, Virginia. The public purpose was straightforward and legitimate on its face. The Asheville to Roanoke freight line needed a more direct route through the Blue Ridge, and the proposed tunnel through Blackthorn Mountain would eliminate a series of switchbacks that added 3 hours to every run. The railroad companies wanted it, the freight haulers wanted it, The State Commerce Board had approved the surveys. Everything about it looked like what it was supposed to look like, which was an expensive but profitable piece of infrastructure. What nobody outside the consortium knew, what I wouldn't learn until decades after the fact, was that the 5 men financing the project had not chosen Blackthorn Mountain because of its position along the rail line. They had chosen it because of a journal. In 1887, a geological surveyor named Ellis Marsh had been mapping potential routes through the Blue Ridge for the original Norfolk and Western expansion. Marsh was thorough, methodical, the kind of man who wrote down everything. He kept a personal journal alongside his official survey notes, and in that journal, he recorded something the official notes omit entirely. Marsh had found a sealed chamber inside Blackthorn Mountain. Not a natural formation, not a cave system that had been blocked by rockfall. A deliberate construction, stone fitted against stone with a precision Marsh compared to Roman masonry, set deep inside the mountain at a point that no natural process could explain. The seal itself was made of a type of stone Marsh couldn't identify, dark, almost black, with a surface that felt warm to the touch even in the cold heart of the mountain. And carved into that stone, in characters Marsh recognized as Cherokee syllabary alongside symbols he had never seen before and couldn't place, was what he described as a warning of the most emphatic and unambiguous kind. Marsh was not a superstitious man. He was an engineer. But something about that chamber stopped him in his tracks. He wrote in his journal that when he pressed his hand against the sealed stone, he felt a vibration. Not a sound, not movement, a vibration that seemed to travel up through his bones and settle somewhere behind his eyes, and in that moment, he experienced what he called a conviction of presence on the far side of the seal so absolute that I withdrew my hand as though from a hot stove. He sealed his personal journal. He made no mention of the chamber in his official survey. He recommended a different route through the mountains, one that added 6 miles but avoided Blackthorn entirely. When his supervisors asked why, he cited unstable geology. He died in 1903 without ever telling anyone what he'd found. His journal passed through 3 estate sales before it ended up, in 1924, in the hands of a Richmond antiquarian named Howard Cartwright. Cartwright was one of the 5 consortium members. He was also, by his own account, in letters that would surface decades later, a man who had been searching for exactly this kind of discovery for most of his adult life. Cartwright had studied the seal's inscriptions through Marsh's careful reproductions. He had identified the Cherokee syllabary components, and through contacts I still don't fully understand, had obtained translations. He knew that the chamber had been sealed sometime around 800 AD. He knew that the sealing had been performed by a coalition so unlikely it defied every historical norm, a collaboration between Cherokee spiritual leaders, the Ani-Kutani priestly class that was later destroyed in what oral tradition records as a revolution, and a group of Moravian missionaries who had no business being in that part of the continent 400 years before their church's official arrival in the New World. These were people who shared almost nothing, different languages, different cosmologies, different relationships with the divine. They had come together for one reason, and the inscriptions made that reason explicit. Something was inside the mountain, something that had been there before the Cherokee, before anyone, something that the Moravians recognized from their own tradition, from Scripture, from the passages in Revelation that describe what waits at the bottom of the pit. Revelation 9:11 names it directly. And they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, and in the Greek tongue hath his name Appalachian. The destroyer. The Cherokee had a different name for it. Thomas Birdcloud's grandmother would have known that name, but she never spoke it aloud, and neither will I. What matters is that 2 traditions separated by an ocean, a millennium, and every theological divide you can imagine looked at the same presence and arrived at the same conclusion. It needed to be sealed away, not killed, not banished. You cannot kill something like this. You cannot send it somewhere else. You can only contain it, and the containment required knowledge from both traditions, a binding that wove together Cherokee spiritual practice and Moravian Christian ritual into something neither could have accomplished alone. That seal held for over 1,000 years. Howard Cartwright wanted to break it open, Not out of recklessness, not out of ignorance. Cartwright knew exactly what was inside. He and his 4 partners had spent 3 years preparing. They had obtained, through channels their own correspondence refuses to describe, a line of communication with the entity behind the seal. I don't know how. The letters reference intermediary contact and terms conveyed through the customary method without ever specifying what that method was, and the absence of that detail has bothered me for 40 years. These were meticulous men. They documented everything else. The fact that they refused to document how they were communicating with the thing inside the mountain tells me the method was something they couldn't put into writing without destroying their own credibility or their own sanity. But communicate, they did. And the terms they negotiated were specific. 19 souls delivered intact to the chamber. In exchange, the entity would provide financial intelligence of a scope and precision that would allow the 5 men to navigate the coming economic catastrophe that the entity apparently knew was approaching with the same certainty you or I might know that winter follows autumn. 19 men's lives for 5 men's fortunes. The consortium agreed to these terms in the spring of 1927, a full year before the first drill bit touched Blackthorn Mountain. Every hiring decision, every crew rotation, every shift assignment after the final breakthrough was going to be made with those 19 positions in mind. The men who would enter the chamber first would be chosen carefully. Not for any quality the entity had specified, as far as I know, but for a quality the consortium preferred, which was expendability. Men without prominent families, men whose disappearance could be explained, men who would be missed by wives and children and mothers, but not by anyone with the power to investigate. I was supposed to be one of them. I need to sit with that for a moment. I've had 43 years to sit with it, and it still stops my breath. I was on the list. My name was on a piece of paper in Howard Cartwright's office in Richmond, written in his own hand, alongside 18 others. I know this because I have seen that piece of paper. I saw it in 1971 when the correspondence surfaced. My name, Thomas Birdcloud, written in neat copperplate with a small notation beside it that read, Cherokee, Qualla, no significant family connections. No significant family connections. My wife, my daughter. My son, who hadn't been born yet. No significant connections. That's what I was worth to them. The reason I survived is not because the consortium took me off the list or had a change of conscience. I survived because I recognized the silence, because my grandmother had loved me enough to describe a terror in terms precise enough that a 26-year-old man could identify it 40 years later in the dark of a mountain tunnel, because she had given me the only weapon that mattered against something like Abaddon, the knowledge to run. Now, the tunnel itself. Boar 17 entered Blackthorn Mountain from the eastern face at an elevation of 3,400 feet, angled slightly downward to maintain the rail grade. The plan called for 1.5 miles of straight bore terminating at the western face, where a matching crew would have been cutting inward to meet them. But the western crew had been pulled off the job in September, 2 months before the breakthrough. The consortium cited cost overruns. The real reason, I believe, is that they didn't want anyone on the other side of the mountain when the eastern bore punched through to the chamber. They wanted one way in, one controlled point of entry. 140 men worked the tunnel in rotating shifts. I was on the drilling crew, night rotation. The work was brutal. 12-hour shifts in air so thick with rock dust that your lantern dimmed to a yellow smear within 50 yards of the face. The walls sweated groundwater that tasted of iron and something else. Something faintly sweet that nobody could identify. The temperature climbed as we went deeper. By October, the bore face was pushing 90 degrees despite the season outside, and the air had a quality to it that the older miners called heavy. Not humid, heavy, like the mountain was leaning on your chest. I remember the smell. Not unpleasant exactly. Mineral. Wet stone and copper. But underneath it, especially in the last 2 weeks before the breakthrough, something else, something organic. Like standing water in a root cellar or the air in a church basement that hasn't been opened in decades. Old air, air that had been sitting undisturbed for a very long time. We hit the first anomaly on October 29th. The drilling team was running a pneumatic hammer line, chewing through the standard granite and gneiss that made up Blackthorn's core when the bit punched through into a void. Not a large one, maybe 6 inches of open space beyond the rock face, but it shouldn't have been there. The geological surveys showed solid stone for another 400 feet. The foreman, a man named Gibbons, packed the void with test charges and blew it wider. When the dust settled and the air cleared enough to see, the bore face had opened onto a section of stone that was different from everything around it. Darker, smoother, cut in straight lines where the surrounding rock was fractured and irregular. Fitted masonry, deep inside a mountain, at a depth and location where no human construction had any right to exist. Gibbons reported it. The consortium's site manager, a man named Price who answered directly to Cartwright, came down within the hour. He looked at the masonry for a long time, running his hands over the surface, and then he told Gibbons to keep drilling. Gibbons argued, said the stone was different, said it might indicate an unknown cave system, said they should survey before blasting. Price told him the investors wanted the bore completed by November 15th, and that his job was to drill, not to think. They kept drilling. Over the next 2 weeks, the anomalies multiplied. The fitted stone appeared in sections running alongside the bore like a parallel corridor that the tunnel was slowly converging with. The temperature continued to climb. The sweet smell grew stronger, and the crew began reporting things that Gibbons logged, but Price dismissed. Small things at first. Tools left at the bore face would be found, moved, not missing, moved. A hammer set against the right wall of the tunnel would be sitting against the left wall when the next shift arrived. Survey stakes would be rotated, lanterns would be rearranged in their hooks, shifted to positions that cast light in different directions, as if someone or something wanted to see different parts of the tunnel. Then the sounds started. November 7th. A driller named Kowalski swore he heard tapping from inside the fitted stone, rhythmic, deliberate, not the random cracking of settling rock, a pattern. He pressed his ear against the dark masonry and listened for almost a full minute, then pulled back and told Gibbons that something was tapping back at them in time with their drilling pattern. Gibbons told him it was echo distortion. Kowalski didn't argue. But I watched his face, and I saw a man who knew the difference between an echo and a response. November 9th. 3 men on the night shift reported hearing singing. Faint, coming from deep inside the stone. They couldn't make out words. They couldn't even agree on the melody. But they agreed it was a human voice, or something very close to a human voice, and it was coming from a direction where no human being could possibly be. November 11th. I experienced something myself. I was working near the bore face, clearing rubble from the previous shift's blast. The crew was 50 yards back, taking water. I was alone in the forward section of the tunnel, and my lantern was doing that thing it had started doing in the last few days, flickering in a rhythm that didn't match any draft I could feel. The fitted stone was exposed along the left wall for about 20 feet, smooth, dark, warm when I touched it, which I did despite knowing I shouldn't. And when my palm made contact with that surface, I felt it. The vibration Ellis Marsh had described in his journal 41 years earlier. It traveled up through the bones of my hand, through my wrist, up my arm, and settled behind my eyes. And in that moment, for just a fraction of a second, I was aware of something on the other side of the stone with a clarity so total it felt like a physical blow. Not a sound, not a shape, a presence, vast, patient, awake. It knew I was there, not in the way a sleeping animal knows a mouse has entered its den, in the way a man sitting in a chair knows someone has walked into the room, with full awareness, with attention, with interest. I pulled my hand back. My fingers were shaking. The vibration stopped the moment I broke contact, but the awareness didn't. For the rest of that shift, working in the forward section of the tunnel, I could feel it watching me through the stone. Calm, curious, the way you might watch an ant crawling across your kitchen table, wondering where it thinks it's going. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't have the words for it yet. But that night, lying in my bunk in the workers' camp, I heard my grandmother's voice in my memory for the first time in years, describing a silence that presses outward, a silence with weight, and I began to understand that the story she had told me was not a story. 3 days later, on November 14th, 1928, the breakthrough blast punched through the last 8 feet of stone and opened bore 17 into the chamber, and the silence came out. I need to describe this carefully. because what happened in the next 90 seconds is the reason 19 men are still inside that mountain, and getting it wrong would be a disservice to every one of them. The blast was standard. 20 pounds of dynamite packed into bore holes along the face, wired back to a detonation box 60 yards behind the line. Gibbons called the charge. The crew pulled back. The mountain shook, and 8 feet of rock became rubble. For maybe 3 seconds, everything was normal. Dust billowing forward through the tunnel, the deep grinding sound of fractured stone settling, men coughing, pulling their kerchiefs over their faces, lanterns swinging on their hooks, standard tunnel work. We had heard that sound 1,000 times. Then the dust stopped moving. Not settled. Stopped. Suspended in the air like someone had frozen time inside the tunnel. I watched a piece of grit hang motionless 6 inches from my face. The lantern flames went flat, stretched horizontal toward the breach, then died. Every single one. 26 lanterns extinguished in the same instant, and the darkness that followed was not the darkness of an unlit tunnel. It was the darkness of something opening its mouth. And then the silence arrived. It came out of the breach like a wave, rolling up the length of the bore toward the entrance. You could track its progress by the way sound died ahead of it. The settling rubble went quiet. The men's voices cut off mid-word. The dripping groundwater along the tunnel walls stopped making contact with anything that could produce noise. The silence moved past us and kept going, out through the tunnel mouth and into the November afternoon. And when it passed over me, I felt my eardrums flex inward, as if the pressure had changed, as if something had displaced the very medium through which sound travels and replaced it with itself. I knew, immediately, without question. The way you know fire is hot, the way you know a cliff edge means falling. My grandmother's description settled over my memory like a template, and every detail matched. I grabbed the man nearest to me. Carl Vickers, 34 years old, machinist from Knoxville, 2 daughters. I grabbed his arm hard enough to bruise, and I pulled him toward the entrance. I didn't speak. I don't think I could have, even if I'd tried. The silence was so total that the concept of speech felt foreign, like trying to remember a skill from a dream. Carl resisted for half a second, then looked at my face and stopped resisting. Whatever he saw, there was enough. We ran. 2 others ran with us. James Dutton, a timberman from Watauga County who had been nursing a bad feeling about the project for weeks, and Samuel Ferris, a blaster who happened to be standing near the entrance when the silence hit, and who later told me that his legs started moving before his mind caught up, as if his body understood something his brain hadn't processed yet. 4 of us. Out of 27 men in the tunnel at the time of the blast, we ran toward daylight. Behind us in the dark, I heard something that I have spent 43 years trying to describe accurately and have never succeeded. Not a sound, because the silence was still absolute. A sensation, a frequency below hearing, felt in the chest and the teeth and the bones behind the eyes. Like the mountain was exhaling, like something enormous was stretching after a long confinement, testing the dimensions of its new freedom and finding them acceptable. Then the screaming started. 1 voice first, then 3, then a dozen, coming from deep inside the tunnel, from the direction of the breach. Men screaming, but not the way men scream in pain or terror. I have heard both, many times in the tunnel and elsewhere. This was different. These screams had a quality of recognition in them, of understanding. As if the men were seeing something so far beyond the framework of their experience that the only response the human body could produce was to scream and keep screaming, because the alternative was to comprehend what they were looking at. The screaming lasted perhaps 40 seconds. Then it stopped. All at once, every voice simultaneously, mid-breath, the silence came back. We reached the tunnel mouth. We kept running. Thomas Birdcloud split his boot leather on the rail ties and didn't notice. That's where this story began, and now you know what we were running from. We stopped half a mile down the grading road. Carl Vickers was doubled over, vomiting. Dutton had sat down on the railbed and was staring back up the mountain with an expression I would come to know intimately over the following decades. The expression of a man whose understanding of the world has been broken and who is not yet sure what will replace it. Samuel Ferris was praying, quiet, Steady, the Lord's Prayer in a whisper, over and over, his hands clasped so tight his knuckles had gone yellow. I stood and watched the tunnel mouth, waiting. I don't know what I expected. The men to come running out, the entity to come pouring out like smoke, the mountain to collapse. Nothing happened. The tunnel sat open and dark against the mountainside, and the silence continued to press outward from it, and nothing came out, and nothing went in, and the 23 men who hadn't run were simply gone. We waited 3 hours. Gibbons was in there. Kowalski was in there. A man named Henry Parkman, who had shown me a letter from his mother that morning, asking when he'd be home for Thanksgiving. A boy named Daniel Reese, who was 17 and had lied about his age to get the job because his family needed the money. 23 men with names and families and plans for what they'd do when the bore was finished. None of them came out. Price arrived at dusk with 4 men from the consortium's private security detail. He listened to our account with an expression I recognized even then as performance. He wasn't surprised, he wasn't confused, he was calculating, assessing how much we knew, how much we'd guessed, and how dangerous we were to the story he was already constructing. He told us there had been a collapse, gas pocket breach, structural failure, tunnel sealed by rockfall. He told us this while we stood within sight of the tunnel mouth, which was visibly open, visibly intact, with not a single stone out of place. He told us this and watched our faces to see if we'd accept it. James Dutton started laughing, not humor, something broken. He laughed for a long time, and then he said, "You knew. You sons of bitches knew what was in there." Price didn't deny it. He just looked at Dutton with those calculating eyes and said, "Mr. Dutton, you have 2 choices. You can accept the compensation package and the account of events as I've described them. Or you can tell your version to whoever will listen and see what it gets you. But I'd remind you that 4 men claiming a demon ate their coworkers tend to find themselves in institutions rather than courtrooms." There it was. Clean and simple. Take the money and the lie, or tell the truth and be destroyed. We took the money. I'm not proud of that. I've had 43 years to not be proud of it. But I had a wife expecting our 2nd child, and $3 a day wasn't going to cover what was coming. And Price knew that, and the consortium had known it when they hired men like me. Men with enough to lose that silence could be purchased, and not enough power to be dangerous, even if it couldn't. They sealed the tunnel a week later, 12 feet of reinforced concrete across the bore mouth. I watched them pour it. Price stood nearby with his arms folded, supervising, and at one point I saw him consult a small leather notebook, checking something against the work. I believe now that the notebook contained the terms, the specifications the entity had provided for its own containment. The concrete wasn't a prison, it was a door, closed from the inside, by something that had received what it was owed and was content to wait. For what, I don't know. I've spent my life trying not to think about that. The official report was filed in December 1928. Tunnel collapse, 19 men killed. The number was wrong even by their own accounting because 23 men had been in the tunnel, which meant they needed 4 survivors to corroborate the story, which meant we were more useful alive and compliant than dead and investigated. The discrepancy between 19 and 23 was handled by transferring 4 names to other project sites on paper. Men who had died in Blackthorn Mountain were recorded as having quit and moved on. Their families received the consortium's compensation. Their bodies were never recovered because there were no bodies to recover. I don't know what happened to those 19 men inside the chamber. I don't know if they died. Dying might have been the mercy, and I'm not confident they received it. The screaming I heard didn't sound like death. It sounded like the beginning of something. A threshold being crossed, not an ending being reached. I try not to think about that either. Some nights I fail. The other 3 survivors. Carl Vickers went home to Knoxville and held his daughters and didn't speak for 11 days. His wife thought it was shell shock. He'd served in France, and she assumed the tunnel collapse had triggered something from the war. He let her believe that. It was easier than the truth. Carl drank. Steadily, methodically, the way a man drinks when he's trying to dissolve a specific memory and keeps finding it intact at the bottom of every bottle. By 1933, he'd lost the house. By 1935, his wife had taken the girls and gone to her mother's in Chattanooga. I visited him once in 1937. He was living in a single room above a hardware store, and the walls were covered with pages torn from Bibles, Revelation mostly. Chapter 9. Over and over. He'd circled verse 11 so many times the paper had worn through in places. "It's still in there, Thomas," he said. "I can feel it. Can't you feel it? Sitting in there behind that concrete, patient as stone. Waiting." "Waiting for what?" I asked. He looked at me with eyes that had gone somewhere I couldn't follow. "For the concrete to not matter anymore." Carl died in 1941. Heart failure, the certificate said. He was 47 years old. James Dutton tried to talk. That was his mistake. He wrote letters to the governor, to the Army Corps of Engineers, to 3 newspapers, and a congressman. He described the entity in terms drawn from Cherokee oral tradition and Christian eschatology and his own terrified vocabulary, and every single recipient dismissed him. The Asheville Citizen ran a small piece calling him a disgruntled former laborer spreading fanciful claims about the Blackthorn Project. The consortium's lawyers sent him a letter reminding him of the compensation agreement's confidentiality terms. In 1932, Dutton was committed to the state hospital in Morganton. His family authorized it. He stayed for 6 years. When he came out, whatever fire had driven him to seek the truth had been extinguished. He moved to a farm in Madison County and never spoke about Blackthorn again. He died in 1959. I attended his funeral. There were 8 people there, and none of them knew what he'd carried. Samuel Ferris found God. Or rather, he found a version of God that could accommodate what he'd experienced. He became a Pentecostal preacher in a small church outside Spruce Pine, and his sermons, by all accounts, were remarkable in their conviction. He preached about the reality of evil with an authority that other ministers couldn't match, because other ministers were working from Scripture. Samuel was working from memory. He never told his congregation what he'd witnessed, never named the mountain or the tunnel or the project. But sometimes, his wife told me years later, he'd wake in the night rigid as a plank, his eyes open, his mouth forming words she couldn't hear. And he'd stay like that for minutes, locked in some interior confrontation, before the tension would leave him all at once, and he'd roll over and sleep like the dead. Samuel died in 1969. Stroke. He was 68. At his funeral, his eldest son told me that his father had been the bravest man he'd ever known, and I agreed, because it was true. Carrying what Samuel carried and still standing in front of people every Sunday to testify about the goodness of creation, that took a kind of courage I've never been able to match. I'm the last one. 71 years old. Lung cancer. 2 months if I'm lucky. I've outlived them all. Carl, James, Samuel, Gibbons and Kowalski and Henry Parkman and Daniel Reese and every one of the 19 who went into that chamber. The consortium members too. Cartwright died in 1952, wealthy beyond imagination, having navigated the Depression and the war with an instinct for markets that his competitors called supernatural. They didn't know how right they were. The cancer is eating me from the inside out, and I'm not afraid of it. I've seen what waits in the dark places of the world. I have felt its attention settle on me like a hand on my shoulder. Lung cancer is a small thing by comparison, a human thing. It follows rules I understand. I'm telling this because 19 men deserve more than a line in a county record book that says tunnel collapse, because Daniel Reese deserves more than a fiction about quitting and moving west. He was 17. He'd never been kissed. He talked about a girl in Burnsville who he was going to marry when he saved enough money, and he carried her photograph in his shirt pocket, and whatever happened to him in that chamber, he went into it with that photograph over his heart. I'm telling this because the seal is concrete, not the woven binding of Cherokee practice and Moravian prayer that held for 1,000 years. Concrete cracks, concrete degrades, and the thing inside that mountain is patient in ways that have nothing to do with human time. I don't know what will happen when the concrete fails. Maybe nothing. Maybe the terms were permanent and the entity sleeps satisfied forever. Maybe Cartwright's transaction was the end of it. But I felt that presence. I touched the stone and felt something look at me with a curiosity that suggested appetite, and everything I know about appetite tells me it is not a thing that one meal satisfies forever. The mountains are still there. Blackthorn is still there. The concrete plug is still there, 43 years old now, exposed to groundwater and root systems and the slow, patient chemistry of a mountain that doesn't care about human engineering. Hikers walk those ridges. Families picnic in the valley below. Nobody remembers. Nobody knows. Sometimes at night, when the morphine is wearing off and the pain hasn't yet climbed high enough to demand my full attention, I feel something at the edge of my awareness, not the vibration, not the silence, just a flicker of that vast, calm attention, like a candle flame seen from a great distance. Memory, probably. An old man's neurons firing their last patterns, replaying the thing that marked them deepest. I tell myself that's all it is. Most nights I believe it. I keep the light on anyway. My name is Thomas Birdcloud. I'm 71 years old. I was there when they opened Bore 17, and I'm the last living soul who knows what came out. 19 men walked into that chamber. Henry Parkman, who was expecting a letter from his mother. Daniel Reese, who was 17 and in love. Kowalski, who knew the difference between an echo and a response. Gibbons, who tried to stop the drilling and was overruled by men who had already sold his crew to something older than the stone. They deserve to be remembered. Not as statistics, not as a line in a county ledger that reads, collapse, as men. As human beings who were betrayed by other human beings who valued money over their lives. That is the truth about Bore 17. That is what the concrete is holding back. That is what I have carried for 43 years and am now setting down, here, in these final weeks, because the truth has to exist somewhere outside my own failing body. Make of it what you will.